right. So maybe like a good place to start is to talk around what it is that got us into critical literacy. So how did we stumble upon it or find our ways to it, and how did we make sense of it initially? And what got us interested in critical literacy. Do you wanna start?
Yeah, I could start. Yeah. The first time I really thought or heard about critical literacy, it kind of came in two sort of separate readings, but it's when I came back to do my master's in children's literature, and one of the courses I had to do was in educational thinking. And I read Farrar for the first time. I hadn't ever read Farrar before, hadn't read it in my teacher training. And as soon as I read the line about education is politics, and Farrar talks about this is a tremendous discovery, and I'm sure he uses the word discovery. And I think for me, that was a really important discovery. It really genuinely was that sort of cartoon light bulb, boing. I think up until that point, I had just been quite so busy on making sure that my classes adhered to the standards, to the curriculum, that we did this, we did that. And I just really saw the curriculum as being quite a benign thing. I didn't think about policy as being political. And when I began to read this, I began to think about policy as being political, and then I began to realise that my role as a practitioner is inherently political as well, in terms of the values I was promoting, the sorts of voices I was permitting into my classroom, the sorts of things I was uncomfortable about permitting. So that was that. And that was obviously, at that point, I was at home with two small children, and so I wasn't actually in the classroom. So I had this really strange sense of, oh, but I've learned this, and what can I do with this knowledge? And then around about the same time, that way when you begin to read really enthusiastically about something and you go from one thing to another, a bit like a pinball, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's when I first came across the work of Barbara Comber and Jennifer O'Brien, and I really do credit them as being people who really kind of, along with that Farrarian moment, helped me understand how something that was sort of theoretical and based, Freiri's work being based with adults in a context I wasn't familiar with, but with this, their work, which was in classrooms, and showing me how I could use everyday texts to develop critical understandings and to foreground the political nature of the act of text creation, and also the act of text deconstruction and reconstruction. So and what they also do, and what Jennifer O'Brien's work, I think she's now retired, but Jennifer O'Brien's work, which was all around about the kind of 1990s, that kind of age, she was looking at how you can develop these practices with younger learners. And I think because I was a mum with little children at that point, everything seemed to fall into place. I suddenly thought, well, here I am as this person that understands that education is politics. And then I began to almost see the politics of being a parent in that way, of the ideological views that I was imposing on my children, and how that is part and parcel of becoming a person in the world, and the impact. So all these things sort of coincided, and probably led to a miserable childhood for so for them. Suddenly I began to see the potential of picture books, of visual text, of being fantastic vehicles into more critical conversations with young children. So I suppose it was meeting Freire, and then meeting Comber and O'Brien's work, and then from then going on to reading about lots of other people who were pursuing critically literate practices with children in classroom settings. So people like Vivian Vasquez as well, began to read Mariana Soto Manning. These people have all been really formative. What about you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I think it's the same kind of thing. It's like what I found interesting about what you were saying is like it's how it's so embedded, how the discovery was so embedded in your life, and like what was going on, and who you were with, and the kind of roles that you were playing in and outside of like schooling contexts, whether it was like higher ed or the high school. And I think for me it was the same kind of thing, growing up in South Africa and being of Indian heritage. I was very kind of I grew up being very aware of the of apartheid and my parents' experience with it. And I was the first, pretty much the first in my family to kind of start off school in an integrated kind of society, this kind of new South Africa that was starting to emerge. You know, whereas my brother and my sister and my family before that kind of always lived in Indian only areas, you know, so the segregation was still kind of rife at that point. And then going into university, I studied a Bachelor of Education for my undergrad. And the one thing that stood out was the program that I studied to become a high school English teacher. And that was underpinned by this idea of critical language awareness. And I think that's primarily because people like Hilary Jenks, for example, worked in that department. And so there was a lot of these questions about power and stuff kind of filtered through, I think, a lot of my undergraduate degree. But I remember very distinctly sitting in a class, in my English class, with my lecturer at the time, who's now become a good friend, and she asked the question of what is a text. So this is probably like in my first or second year of study, fresh out of high school, kind of thinking about, oh, well, it's about reading and writing, this, you know, it's a novel, it's, you know, giving all the standard kind of answers, but she just kept probing what it was and kind of led into a discussion about, well, how do you convey meaning and where does that meaning sit? And is it in a word? Is it in a picture? Is it on a piece of paper? Is it on a screen? Is it an object? And that was like, it was this weird kind of mind-blowing moment where you just realize, well, hold on, that was there, those issues were there all the time. And those objects were there all the time, and those texts, but it was like a whole kind of new way of thinking about it. Yeah, and so like part of that program, we worked with, and I've got a copy here actually. So Hilary Jenks developed like these little workbooks with some colleagues of hers. So I think there's 5 of them, and in each of them there's like a short introduction. And there's a couple of things that really stuck with me. One was that, you know, everyone who was talking about critical literacy seemed to have this understanding that language and communication, maybe in general, or making meaning, stems from people making choices. We make choices about what words to include, how to phrase things, you know, what ideas to put together, how to make connections, what connections we allow other people to see. And those are all of those choices, if we're not aware that they are choices that we're making and decisions that we're making, that we're either like enabling a value system or we're challenging it. And I thought that was powerful, because up until that point, I thought I was quite a proficient speaker of English and writer of English. But then I realized, well, I'm maybe proficient in a very specific kind of English. And so that started raising questions about like social conventions, you know, so what we thought was normal doesn't have to be normal or isn't natural. That isn't, you know, there's so many we take for granted that are actually socially constructed. And if we stop, you know, so we don't ask these questions about it, then we almost always just reproduce those norms. And I think, like you, it was, you know, from those moments of like, what is a text to we make decisions, it started to affect everything. You know, I would walk around, I would go home, and I would hear the way my family spoke, my friends spoke, the places we were in, and I would just notice all these things that were, again, always there. but suddenly I could see, hold on, that should we be saying it like that? Is that really how we should be phrasing it? Or, you know, oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that that was there before. And why aren't we seeing more of this issue or person or way of speaking or whatever it was, you know? So I think that's what it was. It became like a whole new way of seeing the world, and you just kind of, everything that was familiar suddenly became unfamiliar in really interesting ways.
I think that makes me think of several things. One of them is Stephanie Jones is a scholar in the States. Have you encountered her work? She's done. She wrote a book about, which I think was based on her doctorate, about girls and social class and critical literacy. And she's in that book. She writes that she describes critical literacy as being like a pair of eyeglasses. And I think I just like that word, eyeglasses. So I think that's maybe why. But it's this idea when, like you've been saying there about, you know, you've been talking about critical literacy as a lens that affects everything. And once you put these glasses on, these eyeglasses on, it's very hard to unsee what you've seen. So it's that kind of perpetual nagging anxiety you have, like you say, about that goes far, far beyond kind of political correctness, doesn't it? It's that kind of, you know, that might get dismissed as being PC or whatever it is, that in that way, but it is far more like, well, once you've seen this particular way, then it's really hard to unsee that that focus. And what you were saying there about this explicit focus on decision making within a text is something that I was also really one of those other formative understandings for me, because it was a paper by Barbara Comber and Barbara Kamler, and it's one of these really hard papers to come across because I think it was published in a journal that maybe doesn't exist online. So I've managed to get when it had like an issue number of 0, so it's quite hard to find. So I could find the reference if it's of use, and I could try to find the copy I've got. But in that, they talk about basically what happens when you position young learners as researchers, as inquirers into language use, and that's effectively what critical literacy can position. That's the stance you're allowing them to take up. And I use the word allowing there on purpose, because as a teacher, we do allow these things to happen, because we give, you know, within our own power structures, it is that sense that we are permitting, and I don't like using that word, but do you know what I mean? Like, we're using these pedagogies, we're enabling them within our classroom. But anyway, one of the things that the projects that they did was they were getting the children to write quite letters to authors that really took the author to task in a very, very gentle and polite way about the representation of a female character in one of these books. It was an award-winning children's author, and they wrote a letter that really problematized representation, and the letter had been obviously co-written as a class, checked by the teacher, and then it was signed off by the head teacher. So it came from there. But anyway, one of the lines that they wrote in this letter was, "We are very interested in the decisions that authors make." And that's really stuck to me as a bit of a sort of a critical literacy mantra, because the word critical sounds negative and reductive, doesn't it? It sounds like we're going to destroy something, but really it isn't that.
You're always in opposition.
That's right. But I like the fact that here they're saying, look, we're just interested in the decisions that you make. And it's that inquiring curiosity that I think is attractive about that you can say to learners, look, we just need to look at a text and to think, why did the author decide to use that word there? And what's the impact of that word there, or that image there? What would happen if we took out that word and put in a different? How would that affect us as a recipient of that text? And by doing that, you're enabling them to see that text can be changed, that there's not this kind of the quite traditional understanding that once something's written down that it's true, that you can deconstruct a text and then you can reconstruct it with the interests of others, and perhaps more kind of socially just motives at heart. So that's what I was kind of thinking of there when you were talking about decisions. And I used to have that above. I wrote that out and put it above my board in my one of my classrooms as a kind of a reminder that this was what we're trying to think about, why an author's done something, what was their motivation, that kind of thing. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, because I think for me that was empowering, so because I think for a long time, and I mean, even if I think of going to school and some of the teaching that I've done, it's very easy to get stuck into an idea that you're almost like you're a master of the craft, and therefore you're trying to disseminate knowledge, and so the people that we work with, whether they're children or young people or adults, can very easily be positioned to think that they need to be able to reproduce what you're saying and what you're doing as the teacher. And that power dynamic is almost inherent in the classroom anyway. So to like change that and to say, well, hold on, what decisions have authors made in creating this kind of text? What were they trying to do? But now we're sitting in a different position and in a different context, or a different with a different set of values or different pair of eyes. What are you seeing? So what do those decisions from the author kind of reveal about what the kinds of decisions you would make, and who you are, and what assumptions is it making about you? And also because I think in kind of seeing the decision-making process, like revealing that process, you're almost like demystifying how texts are created and how much power they actually have. But then you're also kind of saying, well, hold on, you can create these texts and you can produce these meanings, and it's not, you can control the language doesn't have to control you. And I think that was like a really powerful way of thinking about it. It also meant that, like, especially like thinking about teaching, it was kind of developing this awareness, because I know I have these talks with students at some point in whatever we're dealing with. We have discussions about what kind of language teachers use. Like, how do we speak to the people that we work with, and what kind of effect, so what relationship does that set up? And kind of being aware that the way we speak has that kind of impact or social effect on how things can or cannot be done, whether the people we work with actually feel like they're able to ask the kinds of questions that a critical literacy classroom wants them to ask, or whether the questions are stifled and it's the teacher asking all the questions. Or I think there's a lot to be said about that.
I think it links back to that. I'm sure that Ira Shore has written about this in one of his books about critical literacy, and it's about the fact that, and it links into this Bourdieusian idea about how there are structures that structure us, but we also structure those structures in the same sort of way that language shapes us, but we also shape language for our use. So there's that fact that we are active users of language, but we are also constructed by the language used at us. And so I think that maybe taps into what you're saying, the fact that, are we just trying to ensure that our learners have this heightened awareness of the fact that we have power in our language use, and we can adapt our language use to suit different purposes and different power dynamics, and we do that automatically, but having that heightened awareness helps us understand that. And it makes me think of like one of the practical ways that I tried to implement this in the classroom was to ask my pupils, use the margins sometimes if we had done a piece of writing, I would ask them to tell me about the decisions they had made as authors. So we would kind of go through and we would maybe highlight things. It might be a piece of imagery that they'd used, or it could be perhaps what tense they were, or the person they were using, or whatever it was, whatever technique. And I would just ask, some marginalia, some notes, say, tell me about the decisions that you've made as authors. And by doing that, I was trying to position them as authors and make them understand the act of authoring. And and its kind of inherent ideological nature.
Yeah, yeah. Well, exactly, and I think you're right. There's like a whole lot. What that reminds me of is like reading Vivian Vasquez's Negotiating Critical Literacies with Young Children.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's, you know, if I was interested in critical literacy before, because I thought it was interesting and fascinating, reading Vasquez's book kind of made me fall in love with the field, and just this kind of way of being, because the kids are phenomenal. And it's exactly what you're saying. You know, there are moments where they have to rationalize the kinds of decisions that they make based on the issues that they're seeing and the stories that they're telling. Because I mean, in that work, Vasquez's kids are in kindergarten, but they're seeing like what's happening and who's being left out, and how certain things at the school and in their community, you know, serves some but not others, and so they start asking those questions, and the discussions that she has, it's exactly, I think, what exactly related to what you're describing about like writing in the margins. It's then taking a step back and going, well, hold on, why did you do this? Or why do you think this is the way it is? Or then what do you think you need to do in order to change it? And if you want to change it, how do you think you're going to convince those people who have the power to change it, or who are kind of in control of that space? And so, you know, just through talking and like the different activities, you know, Vasquez does a lot of this with like really young kids. And so there, you know, like, again, like writing in the margins, which I think is like quite a nice metaphor, you know, like writing from the margins. You create this text, but, you know, sitting on the sides and kind of talking back to these texts, whether you created them or you're just reading them, receiving them. There's an active role of kind of unpacking, or what's happening and what is this saying about the world. Because I'm trying to remember who said it, but there's a quote about how texts always represent a version of the world. You know, it's like you said, it's not written down in stone. It's not truth per se, but it's a version of reality. And again, I think that's quite a powerful statement. All right, so I mean, so what do you think this means then, or how do you think this relates to like critical literacy in a Scottish context, and what this might mean for teaching English?
Yeah, I think that there are sort of so many layers we have to look at. So I think that there is a layer we have to think about in the Scottish context and look at the myths of childhood that exist already, in the sense of like how are children constructed in this context, in terms of like what does a normal child response to a text look like what, you know, what do we value? And I think that is sort of can go down to the fact that, do we expect young children to be critical? Do we expect them to ask why and to talk back to text? And I think that maybe goes against some of these notions of childhood, which are obviously far, far bigger than just our Scottish context, but, you know, but they shape what's going on. Then I suppose you could look at policy documents. What exists in critical literacy is mentioned, but it's not explicit, it's not explained. But you might look for toeholds, like things to hold on to, and that, I think, a lot of that, it'd be interesting to interrogate these ideas against a backdrop of increasing emphasis on active learning and active literacy, and to actually ask yourself, okay, so what is this focus on active actually? How can that somehow be sort of linked to the agency that comes with criticality? Are they related? Can we relate them? Can we as teachers take this sort of these gaps that exist, and can we make that work? And And then I think in terms of what we can do as teachers, both you and I know that there is a sort of a pockets of criticality, I think, exist. We know that there are students who leave us who are absolutely enthused about these practices. And we know from our colleague Kelly at Edinburgh that the same kind of thing is coming from her as well, that, you know, there are students who we know are going out and are trying out these practices in their classrooms. And so I think what's interesting for us is to find out is how these things are received. And the thing that's always what made me wonder is if I am a teacher in a classroom, say I am trying to use these approaches in my English classroom, for example, and I am trying to cultivate these attitudes, and that's what Alan Luke describes, isn't it? This attitude. And the other phrase I like that talks about this kind of this approach to the idea that it's not just so much a tick box method, it's an attitude, this idea that it's a stance that we adopt willingly, not something that is imposed upon us. And Ockerman talks about this as being a position or a sense of textual authority. And I think, again, that goes as English teachers, how can we make our learners feel that they have the confidence to talk at a text with that authority? But maybe that's something we can unpack another time. But my point is, if I am a teacher in the classroom trying to, you know, promote these approaches, what happens when they go somewhere else? What happens when they go to another classroom and that teacher isn't doing that, or it's the next year? What happens? The same could happen in any primary or secondary context. Do these practices travel? Do they stay with the child? Does the child say, oh, they're not valued in here? In this classroom, I'm not allowed to ask those questions, or I'm just supposed to accept that we're not going to challenge that stereotype, or whatever else it is, or I'm not going to challenge the construction of knowledge within my textbook and this is all I should know about this topic, whatever it is. And so I get quite, you know, you begin to think about, so how do we take this forward in a Scottish context? We can't impose it if it is an attitude. And if we know it's not a method, that we can just say, do this and you will be critical literate. We know it's not that. But I do think there are definitely pockets of developing activity, lots of space for potential. And it's how do we find out what's going on and what it looks like. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, actually. So do you want to...
Well, I think it raises a lot of things, and I think maybe this is also part of like a critical literacy practice, is that it is about, you know, there isn't a single definite answer, or, you know, I think maybe taking up that critical literacy position also means developing a certain comfort with uncertainty, you know, being kind of realizing that it's okay that you're not necessarily going to get the answer, right? But there's a couple of things that you said that really stood out for me, and I agree. I think this is probably, you know, just going to raise questions for us to discuss in a little more detail at another point. But one was that that all texts are not neutral. And therefore, like, critical literacy is not the same everywhere. You know, it is about developing this perspective or worldview or orientation or stance. You said, you know, it's taking up this lens and applying it to the context that you work in and that you live in. And so what it means to like do critical literacy will change and be shaped by the conditions under which you're working and who you are. That's another thing, you know, you might notice issues differently from the kinds of issues that your learners or your students notice. And that's also fine, but it's also, you know, which of those issues do you choose to take up at that moment? So many factors. And so it is about kind of navigating all of that, as opposed to saying, well, this is, like you said, these are specific strategies, you know, these are ideas that you could do, that you could use. But yeah, there isn't a single answer. And so, yeah.
So I was going to say, if we think about the way that we examine children in the Scottish context, and the fact that we have say, for example, the close reading sort of approach, you know, those tasks. And if you think about the literary traditions that they stem from, and the fact that they are seeing the text as a text, as you know, you're not looking at the conditions of its production. You're not thinking about the text as being a particular production. You're seeing it far more as just the answers are inherent within there. And then, of course, I remember as a learner myself, but also as a teacher, getting really frustrated with when my answer wasn't right, because I thought, well, I can justify it, you know. But when the mark scheme tells you what you can and cannot accept, and I suppose that we're having to train them to answer questions in a very specific way, that doesn't leave much room for criticality often. So I suppose we have to ask questions in our context. Okay, so what sort of learners are we constructing through the practices that we are promoting in our classrooms? And are the literacy practices that we are promoting, are they critical? Do they have any critical potential? Do they have that? I mean, just as you were speaking there, I was thinking about, imagine if literacy across learning in a high school, for example, imagine if that was infused by a critically literate stance. So you had the buy-in of every single teacher into this idea of no text is neutral. And that might be an underpinning kind of starting point from a school, that we understand that no text is neutral, and we recognise that kind of like the particularity of a text that it's always kind of shaped by the conditions of its production, all that, you know, and its reception, all that stuff. How amazing would that be if literacy across learning could be far more than just kind of common codes of spelling and punctuation and marking things, if it actually be this view of literacy as particular.
I think that's what fascinated me about the curriculum. The curriculum is, despite all the criticisms and maybe this kind of weird fixation on attainment, which again is like a very specific kind of version of what attainment looks like. The fantastic thing about Scottish education is its potential, because it has, like you said, there's the potential to do things using the curriculum that really move beyond the kind of basic like technical approaches, you know, where learners are just learning how to read this particular text and what this particular author is saying, and to interrogate those texts but it is that it's the fact that there is the potential to do critical literacy within the existing curriculum kind of framework that is fantastic. It means that if teachers do take up, I agree, I think it would be fantastic if you had like whole schools take up this disposition. But it means that as a teacher, if you do take a critical literacy approach, or any kind of critical approach, and you see the social issues, you can act on it. And then, yes, it does mean that you might have to rethink, you know, what counts as good assessment. You know, when learners, or when kids produce texts, what kinds of texts are they producing? You know, you might start off with some of the existing strategies, you know, so using like those paragraph structures, for example, but then linking those paragraphs, and maybe adding a bit into the paragraph that deals with power or identity or the social impact, you know. So the author said this, here it is in the quote. What does this mean? Where have you seen this before? Why does this matter? And where does that come from? And I think, you know, there's the potential for just building onto what's already there. But it is, I mean, there is that long history of kind of understanding language from a very literary perspective. And it is that kind of Enlightenment era understanding of what it means to study language and literacy, which means that you're looking for a particular or a set kind of meaning, as opposed to negotiating and unpacking, and where meaning is a lot more fluid, and you're seeing how it's underpinned by ideology or the value systems of the time, and how those value systems might have changed. And yeah, So I think those complexities, there's space for it, but yeah, we need maybe teachers and schools and these kind of those actors, those agents to be driving that forward.
And with what you've said there, you can see why critical literacy might become stifled in such a context. If you're someone who's just left your PGDE and you've been inspired by you and you've got this kind of like, I want to do this, I want to try it out, and then you get into a context where, like you say, that the forms of assessment don't quite make space for it because there is a sort of a correct answer. And while there is, breadth within those answers up to a point, there's still there's not that room, that scope, and it's not really officially promoted anywhere. So then you think, well, hang on, maybe this is the wrong thing, or how do you negotiate? How do you make room for that negotiation? And then there's the thing about the risk that can come from opening up these spaces for discussions about topics that can be controversial and can be really challenging, I think, for teachers to take on. And it's what happens if you open up something and it leads to some sort of upset or discussion that you might try to shy away from. So these are things we have to work with. It is a sort of a risky or a pedagogy, but it is by working through those things that you're enabling learners to really engage with these issues in powerful ways, and hopefully to develop a sort of a literate habitus that allows it, means that they have these tools at their disposal. They're part of their makeup.
Yeah, and I like that you use the word habitus there, because that's probably probably a good way to wrap up. That article by Vasquez, Jenks, and Comer on critical literacy is a way of being and doing. I think that's also been a thread in our own conversation today, is that it is, yes, it's a set of practices, but what those practices look like are intrinsically related to who you are and where you are and who you're working with and what issues matter to the people that you're working with, and what's kind of possible in those contexts. And I maybe want to discuss like one brief kind of example, is that especially when we think about critical literacy being like a risky pedagogy, because it is, and actually that sometimes makes it fascinating just brilliant to be in the classroom, because it's when you have students that can catch you out on moments where you've said something, but you've said it in a way that has real implications or positions students in a particular way, and as a teacher you also don't realize it. I mean, we're all still human here, but in a space where a student can kind of call you out on it, and then you can talk about it and learn from each other about, well, oh, okay, hold on, so what is a better way of saying it, or how would you have spoken about that differently, or what are you noticing that I'm not noticing, so I think there's also I would like to think that there's a level of humility as well. So even as teachers who direct critical literacy projects or curriculums, it's also about realizing that, because we're human, there are limitations to our own perspectives, so as much as I would, I think I try to do feminist work in the classroom, I have to realize that I identify as male. And so there's a limit to my understanding of a feminist or a female experience. But there are others. The whole point is that I've got a range of people in my classroom. And so there's a range of perspectives to draw on, because there are people who know things and see things and do things that I don't. And so it becomes awfully generative and collaborative when we start seeing each other and the differences, and both our similarities and differences, as resources for coming to grips with the world that we live in. And I think that's the exciting part, is that once you're comfortable with that, then I think you're right. There's the potential for some really awesome stuff to be done.
That's a very good place to stop. You've summed it up perfectly. Yeah, I think there's so much potential, and like you say, it's an invigorating approach, isn't it? Like you say, it keeps you on your toes, and there's no room for complacency because, as you say, you can be called out on things and asked to really reconsider your own positionality